I was sat in the classroom at school, writing lines. I looked at the clock in the corner of the room. It was 5:30, after school hours. I looked about once more to see that there was no teacher stood at the front of the class to make sure I didn't misbehave. I frowned at this, contemplating whether I should simply walk out of the classroom and see if I was noticed, but I theorized that they were bound to notice me and that I would be punished once again for that. So, yeah, I just, decided that it was a case of the quicker I finished writing lines, the sooner I could leave. I continued to write, copying the line I had just written, and not really paying attention to the words or the content of the sentence. Suddenly, I became aware of a sound breaking the silence. It sounded like static. It was getting louder and louder. It came from behind me. I froze, listening. I'd heard the stories and my mind immediately flickered to the slender man. For a second, I just sat there, afraid to turn around. Then I calmed myself, as I realized that it couldn't be static, as there were no TVs, no computers, or no radios in the room for the static to possibly be coming from. Breathing heavily, I turned to see the door slide shut. It had come loose from its doorstop, and what sounded like static had been the sound of the wooden stop scraping against the carpet as the door swung shut on its drop hinges. With a sigh of relief, I turned back to my lines and continued writing. However, as I did, I became more and more conscious of the feeling that I was being watched. I froze, staring at the paper before me. It was only at this point that I realized what I had been writing. For the first couple of lines, they simply read, "Don't look." But after that, after I had heard the noise, they read, "I told you not to look." This made the hair on the back of my neck stand up as I suddenly became aware of breathing coming from the front of the class. Now thoroughly creeped out, I slowly raised my head to see that there was a figure stood staring at me. Her face seemed familiar to me, but I couldn't place it. It seemed to be blurred, almost as if by motion. Her clothes were ripped and grubby, and her skin looked red and dark. I frowned, staring back at the girl who, now that I had noticed her, began to move forward. With each step she took, I became more and more unnerved. Her details became clear as she neared, and to my horror, I saw that what I thought was dark red skin was actually muscle and tissue. She had no skin. It looked to have been ripped from her body, leaving her veins, bones, and organs intact, fully intact. I held back a scream as I stood abruptly, backing away as she continued to approach. I felt myself backing into the door that had swung shut earlier, and with this, I turned and pelted through it. Sprinting down the dimly lit corridor, I didn't look back. I just wanted to get out or hide or anything to get away from that thing. After a long while of running, I eventually grew tired and ducked into another classroom, slamming the door behind me and leaning against it. Attempting to catch my breath, I closed my eyes, breathing heavily. After a moment, I managed to slow my heart rate a little and open my eyes to see the fleshless face staring back at me through the small window that was set in the door. I jumped, turning to run further into the classroom in a hope of finding a place to hide or even another way out. But as I did so, there she was, standing right in front of me. Her eyes bored into mine, and I felt the same feeling of recognition I had felt when I first saw her. I was frozen to the spot, her stare boring into me as I stood, anxiously wondering what was to become of me. She raised her arm above her head, and I saw a large, jagged rock clutched tightly in her hand. Before I could do anything, she brought it down towards me, and everything went black. When I woke, I first became aware of the pain in my head. It throbbed, and I could feel a trickle of blood seeping through my hair and into my eyes. I blinked, my vision blurred by the thick red liquid, and looked around. As my vision cleared, I saw that I was in the school basement. It was normally out of bounds to students, but at present this seemed totally irrelevant. Then I noticed the masks that were hung around the walls. Faces, all of them blank and eyeless. After a moment of staring, however, I couldn't stop myself from letting out a small shriek of fear as I realized that they were no masks. They were actually faces, the skins of many people. Now that I looked more closely around the place, I saw that it wasn't just faces. There were pieces of skin that looked like they had been cut from arms, legs, chests, and all manner of different areas of the body. I realized that my shriek of terror had alerted my captor to the fact that I was awake, and she now approached. I could see the glint of a long kitchen knife held in her flesh-deprived hand. I stammered, stumbling over my words, until I eventually blurted out the only thing I could think to say. "Why?" I asked. Her voice rasped as she halted before me and answered. "So soft, so smooth. Yours is clear and smooth. Mine was not. Mine was scarred, bruised." Her voice was almost childlike, almost playful. She approached me and, holding the knife before her, she muttered. I was powerless. I must have blacked out once more, as the next thing I knew, I was back in the caravan, sat on the floor in the corner. Groggily, I looked around me. I saw no one. Then I remembered and looked down at my hands. The skin was still there. However, there were cuts and scars all across them, spanning the entirety of my arms. I frowned, wondering why she had spared me. As I inspected my arms, rubbing them curiously, I noticed that there was a small patch of flesh that was untouched by the knife. I stroked it with interest. It was soft, smooth, clear.